see everyone here today. My name is Erin Null, and I am the editor of our new imprint at Corwin called Corwin Mathematics. And I'm very pleased today to bring to you a panel of some of our most prestigious authors and mathematics education professionals. We have with us today two former NCTM presidents, Skip Fennell, who is author of co-author of the forthcoming book, The Formative 5, which is about everyday classroom-based assessment techniques for mathematics. And we also have Linda Gojak, co-author of the Common Core Mathematics Companions for grades K through 5, as well as co-author on Visible Learning for Mathematics, which is a new book that will be out next week. Joining Linda and Skip, we also have Ruth Harbin-Miles, a longtime Corwin author and mathematics coach and former K-12 mathematics coordinator, also co-author of the Common Core Mathematics series. And then finally, but not least, we are joined by John Sangiovanni. John is the coordinator of elementary mathematics at Howard County Public School Systems and the author of our very brand newly released books as of this week called Mind the Gap for Mathematical Understanding. We're going to go through some questions today based on the questions that you all submitted when you registered for this webinar. So hopefully we'll be able to hit the high points, the burning needs that you are looking to learn more about. Any questions that we end up not having time for or not getting to, or that you'd like to submit afterwards, we will be happy to collate and send to the authors for some follow-up. I want to just remind everyone, too, that the webinar is being recorded, and we will be sending out the link to the archive. So if anyone missed it, or if you would like to forward it on to a colleague afterwards, you'll be able to do that. Okay, so let's get rolling. The first question that we had from our audience is really a grounding one. And Skip, I would love if you could kick us off here talking about what is formative assessment and how is it different from summative assessment? How do they interrelate?
Sure. Thanks. And like Erin, thanks for all of you for getting involved in this call, particularly at this time of the day for some of you. I think let me just say that we've been sort of figuring out formative assessment for the last 60 or so years, and simply put, at the classroom level, you use formative assessment to monitor and guide teaching and learning. More formally, it includes all the activities that you and your students complete, which provide information to sort of guide you in thinking about the success of a particular lesson, what your next steps are for tomorrow, and so forth. So formative assessment is very, very directly tied to your planning and your teaching every day, which is what the book that Erin alluded to earlier tries to address. Now, summative assessment those are typically used to measure something at the end of an event. By end, it could be the end of a unit. It could be the grades that are provided at the end of a marking period. It perhaps are school district benchmarks that your district may have teachers use. So there's certainly the more high-profile end-of-the-year state assessments that people use around the country to sort of deal with now No Child Left Behind and soon ESSA. So those are bigger. They're often used to compare student performance, whereas formative assessments are more to guide. I mean, one way that I kind of connect them is that summative assessments are thought of as ways to are assessments of learning, whereas formative assessments are assessments for learning. But they knit together. Formative assessments that you do every day guide you as you help to look at the results of summative. And together, they provide, the full portfolio of what a student knows and or is able to do. So I hope that gives us some starting point for the differences between and how, frankly, both are important.
Thank you, Skip. Ruth, I would love to throw the next question to you. If you could share, I know this is a discussion we've had in the past, what are one or two very practical classroom-based ideas or strategies that you've used in lessons before?
Well, I'm very, very pleased to share two very practical ideas and strategies, and I'm going to share those two, and then Skip is going to chime in. The two that I'm going to share are observation, and the second strategy is show me. Let me just start with observation. Obviously, every teacher observes students, but as a formative assessment technique, it's what you do with the strategy of observation that matters, and it's how you align that observation with planning and teaching. When you're planning a lesson, you always determine the lesson's focus and how you will actively engage the students. But when you're using observation, you should think about and plan specifically what you're looking for as you observe students, and then thinking about how will you use the information to monitor and sequence the lesson, and then also think about how will what you've observed help plan for the next day's lesson. I want to share a real quick example because, as Erin said, I coach in an elementary school, and a first grade teacher that I was working with opened her math class with a problem that was something like this. I have 3 coins, a quarter, a dime, and a nickel. How much money do I have? She gave the students a minute to answer, and it was very interesting that half of the students immediately said 40 cents, which of course is the answer. There was absolutely no discussion, and I noticed that 6 of the students said 15 cents. They had been using individual whiteboards. The teacher said to them, oh, you know, for the kids that didn't get it, that's okay, don't worry about your answer, we're going to practice. But then all of a sudden, 6 of those kids put their heads down on their desk, and then the teacher moved right on. Well, after the lesson, the teacher and I started talking, and she had noticed that several of the students, in her own words, just didn't even get the problem. She knew she needed to make some adjustments. So while planning for the next day, we talked about anticipating those misconceptions and the misunderstandings. And we talked about allowing the students to explain their thinking and that she needed to provide some feedback. The teacher actually changed and then reworded the problem the next day, and the problem she did was, I have 5 coins in my pocket. The coins can only be pennies, nickels, dimes, or quarters. I reach into my pocket and I pull out all 3 coins. How much money might I have? With her newly adjusted problem, the students were able to share multiple ideas, and they were able to discuss with one another, and they were even justifying their thinking. So the first one is observation, and real quickly, the second technique I want to talk about is show me or convince me. Although the teacher in my previous example had been using individual whiteboards, she was originally only looking for the correct answer. Every student was responding, but it wasn't working. I always like to start with the show me technique with a prompt, such as show me how you solve the problem, or share the strategy for solving the problem, or be ready to describe how you solve the problem. And I know that Linda uses the convince me that your answer makes sense. When you have students respond with show me or convince me, well, this is more in depth because the students are explaining their thinking and demonstrating what they are doing. So the two strategies real quickly, a formative assessment you can just use tomorrow, or observation and show me. They're both strategies that support differentiation, and they help monitor student progress, and they help inform your instructional decisions. Skip is going to chime in next and add on.
Yeah, I just wanted to, affirm what Ruth said, because both of those strategies are part of the formative, what we refer to as the formative 5, in working with teachers. And our experience has been that, first of all, anyone who teaches in a classroom all day long observes students throughout the day. And we almost don't recognize or place sort of a minimalist value of that very important assessment technique. You see what's going on. You see kids all day long. So the use of observation, if you will, more scientifically, to sort of say, as you plan that lesson, what do you expect to observe? Here's this lesson on whatever the content happens to be. What are your expectations, observation-wise? And as you then observe, are there places where what you observe, a performance you observe, a strategy that you observe, would suggest to you that you might want to engage another strategy, which might be an interview. And when we talk about the interview, we're not necessarily talking about a clinical interview, which is quite formal, but it might just be pulling a group or a few students aside, or frankly one student aside, and hey, tell me how you did that. Can you walk me through that solution, perhaps of the example that Ruth gave, and not only walk me through it, tell me why you did it that way. Was there something special about that? We found that, again, such an intervention, and that's what that is. The interview really provides that, and then the show me to me is, to us at least, is a performance. We're suggesting that the student performs. Show me what you're doing. Talk to me about why you did it that particular way. Could you do it another way, and so forth. So all three of them, very informal, observing, interviews as appropriate, show me to sort of, get that performance beyond an observation, are ways that as you move around the classroom, it's funny because I remember my teacher candidates used to say, well, we're wandering around the classroom. I never liked the use of the word wandering. But as you move around the classroom, you're using these techniques to monitor that lesson you observe. You may want to have an interview. You may want to have students show you what you're doing. Those are some ways that informally, very practically, you can get at this every day.
Thank you so much, Skip. John, you and I have talked about this a bit in the past as well. When you're talking about formative assessment techniques or strategies, what is your opinion of exit flips, and how do you do exit flips, or maybe is there an alternative for students who don't particularly read or write very proficiently?
Okay. Well, first let me say welcome, and I'm glad to see so many people involved today. Exit slips, I think they're okay. I think that in some spots they've become the hallmark for formative assessment. And I think it really comes down to, how you use them or what you're using them for. And that kind of aligns exactly what Ruth was talking about in terms of what do you do with it. It also makes me think about Ruth's comments relative to observation and Skip's comments relative to interviewing. But to speak to exit slips just for a moment, sometimes we use them, they end up becoming a grade, and when that happens, then it's just become a summative assessment. I like them in terms of using them for tomorrow and making decisions about what I might do the next day or the day after, but one of my challenges with exit tickets are that they, don't necessarily help me make decisions on the spot. And I think of them as after-the-fact type thoughts. So when I think of other options for closing the class, I think about journal reflections or opportunities for kids to assess themselves. I think those are nice options that are alternatives to exit slips. But I really, when working with our teachers and having conversations about making the moment decisions, we talk a lot about relying on the observation during a math activity. We talk a lot about observation during games or center activities and gathering information there. We talk a lot about, as we facilitate a discussion and we think about the evidence of understanding or misunderstanding for that matter, we talk about how to make that work. Student work during any activity can be a nice documentation of what students have done during the class, and so therefore, may render the exit slip irrelevant. And another thing we talk about often is using our phone or a tablet to take a picture of student work and document that. I think sometimes we feel that we need a piece of paper as an artifact to see what students understand or don't understand, and I think that those images or snapshots can be used well also.
Thank you, John. That's really interesting to think about the whole process going throughout the classroom and observing so that the exit slips are sort of a moot point, which definitely gets to those.
Erin, I almost hate to do this, but I'm going to jump in here because
Go for it.
My sense is that exit frankly, here's what I used to say. Here's an exit ticket, and my comment was, where are you going? I have found exit tickets, exit slips to be trivial. That they're often, far too often, not really going after the high quality, high level mathematics, the sort of thing that you might get in a task that's meaty, that really is sort of gets at the thrust, particularly conceptually, of the lesson. So, I mean, in our work, we very deliberately call them exit tasks to get away from what I just mentioned, which, frankly, John's, I think, explanation did as well. But I just thought the mere phrasing of it drives me crazy.
Duly noted. Thank you. And I know in your book you talk about exit tasks quite a bit, and as those being different from exit slips. Okay.
And can I interrupt one other thought?
Sure, of course.
Yeah, Skip, you make a really great point, and I think that idea of exit is problematic. I really like the idea of engaging in rich tasks throughout the lesson and then having closure for the lesson more so than an exit slip. So I just wanted to throw that in there. I think that's a really good point.
Great, thank you. I'd like to move on to the next question. And Ruth, and feel free, Linda, if you would like to chime in here as well. Being two experts on standards, mathematics standards, how do teachers know that they're assessing with rigor and with fidelity the standards that they're teaching, or the standards to which they are teaching?
Well, this is Ruth, and to answer the question, I want to first give my definition of rigor. Because to me, rigor means thinking and reasoning and depth of knowledge. The Common Core content standards and the standards for mathematical practice strongly promote that thinking and reasoning and depth of knowledge. So the thing of it is after you internalize and really understand the standards and the SMPs, and by the way, as Erin said, if you don't, Linda and I have a book for you to read. I'll plug it, The Common Core Math Standards, what they say, what they mean, and how to teach them. Well, after you totally understand these standards, you will know that the topics in the standards are not surface-level topics. And the standards require that depth of knowledge. The standards cannot be assessed as low-level topics. So what I do is I always go to the websites of PARC and Smarter Balance, and I just take a look at the types of problems and the examples they promote on their website. And then I also take a look at many states who have released assessment items, and they share oftentimes these items on their State Department websites. And the released items show types of rigorous assessment items and how they might look. But simply stated, teachers will know that they are assessing with rigor and fidelity to the standards if they are choosing assessment problems and questions that are driven with thinking and reasoning and conceptual knowledge.
That's great, Ruth. Thank you so much. John,
This is Linda.
Oh, I'm sorry, Linda. Go ahead.
Jump in.
Of course.
So I totally agree with everything Ruth said. And I think in addition to that, one of the things we need to be really aware of when we are doing particularly formative assessment is focusing in on a couple of other aspects of rigor that also involve thinking and conceptual understanding. But that's, are we really seeing if kids have conceptual understanding of the topic and not just procedural knowledge or procedural skills? And I think that that's something that's really critical as we look for the kind of tasks that we give kids. And by the way, when I was in the classroom, I think everything I gave the kids and looked at how they were doing and how they were thinking, I was constantly using formative assessment. So it wasn't a matter of I had to stop and say, okay, now I'm going to give you this little formative assessment or exit ticket. It was just constantly being aware of what the kids were doing. So I think that when we give kids rich tasks to complete, or if we want to just do a spot check on something, we need to be well aware of, are we checking conceptual understanding? Are we checking procedural skill? Are we giving a context to see if our kids can apply this mathematical understanding to a particular context? That's also a part of rigor and fidelity around the standards. And reading those standards and understanding them deeply. I've worked with a couple of different fifth grade teachers, very interesting when they get to the division of fraction standards, and somehow they interpret those as just teaching the kids how to invert and multiply. Well, if you go back and read those standards carefully, there's no place where they talk anything about invert and multiply. So really understanding what is it that the standard is expecting the student to know and be able to do, and what part of the learning trajectory is happening at that particular point in time. So these are the kinds of tasks that I really want to build my classroom around and the assessments around. The thinking that Ruth mentioned, the reasoning that Ruth mentioned, but also being aware of, am I checking a conceptual understanding? Am I checking conceptual knowledge? Am I putting this in a context that will help kids to, or that will help the students to really show me what it is they understand?
That's great, Linda. Thank you. I think the emphasis on, really that backward design is so important. And you mentioned tasks. And a question that we have been getting frequently is about where teachers can find good standards-aligned tasks, and then how do they use them to uncover misconceptions in a way where they're doing formative assessment, and how do they respond? John, this is really the topic of your entire book. I would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. Well, I think we know that we can find tasks anywhere online, and that doesn't necessarily mean that those are standard aligned or quality for that matter. And so first I think about quality tasks and their importance, and the first step is that they're standard based or they're aligned to the mathematics that we're teaching. So the first part of this question, where do we find good standards? I think of illustrative math or illustrative math, depending on how you prefer to pronounce that. NCTM eliminations are good online sites. Enrich math. Many districts and states have good sites for rich tasks, and let's not forget that there are many print resources from Corwin and NCTM and others that provide a host of quality tasks. But I think what's important to note there is that all of those places I just cited have some things in common, and that they're noted, they're reliable, and we can have confidence in their quality. And then it's up to us to figure out how to make them coherent. But I think that the important piece here is selecting those good tasks, those rigorous tasks, so that we can uncover not just misconceptions, but also their students' incomplete understanding. And so, for example, if I think about comparing 2/5 and 5/8 and giving a child a sheet of comparisons, where they're circling the greater fraction, that may not tell me if they really have any strategies or reasoning behind how they compare fractions. I may ask a child then to tell me how you compared two fractions. So for instance, how did you compare 2/5 and 5/8? When I begin to do things more deeply or in a better, more rigorous way, students will then tell me that they compared them by the number of pieces that are missing. So 5/8 is greater than 2/5 because 3 pieces are missing from 5/8. And in this case, it's true. However, the number of pieces may not always be indicative of the greater fraction. And so we need those quality tasks so that we can uncover not just the misconceptions, but understanding that it isn't always complete. So when we're looking for those standards-aligned tasks, we want to think about, do they encourage students to use representations? Do they provide students with opportunities to communicate their thinking? Do they have multiple entry points? Does it allow for multiple strategies or different strategies for finding a solution? And then we don't want to lose sight of, is it problem-based? Is it authentic? Or is it interesting?
Great. Thank you so much, John. In the interest of time, I'd like to keep us moving. The next question, I'd like to throw this one to you, Linda. We've talked a lot in our work together about some questioning techniques to clarify misconceptions without saying too much. So how do you help students gain that understanding without leading them with too much on the teacher's part?
So I think before we actually think about our questioning techniques, there's a couple of steps that come first, and I actually steal these ideas from Peg Smith's book on the 5 productive practices. I think we have to do some anticipation of where do we expect the kids will be. What kind of misconceptions might they have? Where might they be getting it or not getting it? Or John's wonderful example of kids can explain that there's a difference of 3 between the numerator and the denominator in those 2 fractions he used, but does that the kids really understanding, is their strategy actually working for the particular case? So I think anticipating misconceptions and then being ready to identify misconceptions in student work. So as I'm looking at what kids are doing, and I'm really thinking about this more of, again, as I mentioned earlier, formative assessment is just something that's ongoing in my classroom. So when kids are working in groups to solve problems and I'm walking around looking at their work, what is it I'm looking for to identify any misconceptions they might have or strategies they might have that would be interesting to share with other kids. And then I think you have to focus on the discourse that students are having, whether that discourse is a conversation they're having within a group or with the whole class or their written work. And again, I'll go back to what Ruth said earlier. I used to say to my kids, explain your thinking all the time, and they kind of look at me like, what? And so now when they give me an answer, go, convince me you're right. I love the words convince me. So asking students to explain what they've done so far, and by the way, oftentimes when you ask kids to explain, they automatically make the assumption that they're wrong, because too often that's the only time we ask kids questions is when they're wrong. But getting kids to actually think about their reasoning and the focus on the reasoning rather than just the answer. So what I like to do is walk around when kids are working in small groups and approach each group and ask them about the work they're doing and be able to look at their work rather than trying to figure out what everybody in the class is doing at one time. So asking kids what they've done so far, looking to see are any of those misconceptions that I anticipated happening, and if so, how am I going to address those? So a big part of this is really developing, I love the word anticipatory step, developing that, what am I expecting to happen in the classroom? What am I watching for? How do I know when kids get it and when kids don't get it? And asking questions and whether they get it or they don't get it, that oftentimes helps kids to be able to listen to one another talk. And sometimes if a child doesn't understand, but they're listening to somebody else explain their thinking in a small group, or with the whole class for that matter, that they can often undo their own misconceptions by saying, I didn't think about that way. So I think the focus is on getting kids to talk about and write about their thinking.
That's great. Thank you. Skip, I think you had wanted to add something to that as well.
I actually wanted to tag on to that a little bit, and Linda, you probably didn't know this, but you set me up pretty nicely in a sense that Dylan William talks a lot about what he refers to as a hinge point question or a hinge question, and it's a setup question, so that you're planning this lesson and you're thinking about what's going to happen tomorrow, and it's the lesson. And as lessons do, sometimes they're on multiple concepts, and sometimes it's a focus on a particular concept or moving from a concept to application of it or what have you. So the hinge question is diagnostic. It's sort of like an interview for a group. You're reaching towards the end of that lesson and you're going to ask this question about whatever it happens to be, fraction equivalence or the example that John gave or what have you. And you're going to monitor those responses and frankly know on your feet where those kids are with regard to where you're going in that lesson. And if it's that kind of a lesson where you're going to have, multiple touch points, then there will be hinge point questions. It could be 2, maybe even 3 at most, I would guess, in such a lesson. But such questions, first of all, to me, the sign of a really good and experienced teacher is one who understands questioning, is adept at not only posing questions, but adjusting questions on his or her feet to meet the needs of the audience, your students. So the hinge point sort of gets at that, and it really helps shape not only and shape and define not only where the class is, but where you're going to be that evening as you plan the next lesson.
Thank you, Skip. And, I'd love to stick with that line of thinking and stick with you for a moment. The first part of our next set of questions has to do with how teachers can make formative assessment part of their planning process, which, of course, alludes back to what Linda said about anticipation and anticipatory sets and also planning that hinge question. So what advice do you have there?
Well, I mean, part of the challenge of this, frankly, is historic, and that is for way too long, educators have thought, well, here we have planning and teaching, and here we have assessment, and frankly, and on top of that, we call those things tests. So what we're suggesting, not only in this call, but I think as we think about curriculum writ large, is that there's a connection as you plan that lesson. What's the topic of the lesson? What might you be doing? And as you plan that lesson, what do you expect to observe? When in this lesson are there some bumps that just are going to drive you to interview one or more kids on that topic or what have you? And you know your students well enough that by the way, interviews are not necessarily for kids who are having problems. Interviews are for kids who are giving you a response that, frankly, you can't figure out. I need to talk to you. You need to show me what you're doing here. And that hinge point sort of defines the closure element that John talked about, and then the exit task kind of nails that down. So that the notion that assessment is apart from teaching and planning is a problem for us in education, and all of those are integral. As you plan, you think about how you might assess, and as you roll that lesson out, as you're on your feet teaching it, you'll be observing, and you'll be thinking about how I'm going to, work with that child who's given you a response that frankly you don't understand. So they're very much connected and ought to be thought about in the planning process every single day.
That's great. Thank you. And in thinking about not just the planning, but then how do you adjust during the lesson when those when you discover that students are not on board, they're not mastering what you were hoping they would, or they're having the misconceptions you thought they might. What do you do in the moment? John, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and I think Skip had a couple thoughts on this one as well.
Yeah, well, I think it comes down, when you talk about what do you do, I think it's really goes back to what Linda was talking about in studying Peg Smith, and that idea that anticipation is critical, as well as considering what evidence is. And so I think often we think about what you do as being a reactive step, and I'd like to think more of it as a proactive step. And what I mean by that is that many of us are trained to write lesson plans that identify what materials we were going to use and how we would grab our kids' attention and the steps that we were going to take as teachers. And today we're talking with teachers about thinking about what's going to happen and how might you react to it when it happens, or why do you think it might happen, and what issues or challenges my kids have, so that when those things do in fact occur, we're prepared to respond to that. So again, there's an infinite amount of things that we might do during a lesson to react to students who are not mastering, and the joke louder and slower is not the best way to react. But at the same time, not having a plan for reaction is a bad idea as well. So, to summarize my statement is simply anticipating and considering what will be evidence of understanding, or even, for that matter, misunderstanding, so that we can react. And one last point, too, is that this is all grounded in the idea that, we know the math really, really well from a conceptual standpoint and a procedural standpoint, so that we can be aware of where things may go awry.
Yeah, so that's really nice, because now we have 3 responses in a row that deal in one way or another with anticipating, and I think that's critical. In other words, as you plan and you think about what that lesson's going to look like, you're anticipating the lesson, you're anticipating how you might use observation or show me, or what that hinge question is going to be like, and so forth. And then it kind of sort of, if you will, also implies confidence in the teacher who knows that mathematics and who knows their children in terms of the rollout of that lesson, and confidence to the point where you can slow the lesson up. Sometimes you can move it faster than you thought. Sometimes you'll change that hinge question on your feet. So the getting to the point where you're adept at planning and implementation allows you to do that, and that essentially makes planning and assessment and instruction pretty seamless.
Great, thank you so much. I want to move to the nuts and bolts questions that some of our audience had about formative assessments. And those had to do with things like how long, how many questions should they be, how do I work multiple types of assessments into my daily schedule. Ruth, would you take that first one? What do you think about that question? How long and how many questions should a formative assessment be?
Well, first of all, formative assessment should be given every day, and in Skip's words, I think he said it's just what you do as a teacher. I plan my formative assessments and my questions, at least the majority of the questions I might ask ahead of time. And I personally try to do one show me or one convince me question each day so that I can have students explain or, as Linda says, convince me, and I can promote that student thinking and reasoning. And this usually takes me about 10 minutes of my class period. And then I always do a deal breaker or a hinge question, and this usually takes me about 5 minutes, and I personally try to do an exit task, not an exit slip, but a task when I'm trying to document the student learning, and that usually takes me, I plan about 5 or 6 minutes doing that at the end of the class period. The 20 minutes or so of time that I spend with these formative assessment techniques helps me, as Skip said, set students on my feet rather than spending time grading papers late at night on my feet. And so I am literally using these 3 techniques almost every day, and I know that they really do boost achievement scores, and they help me with planning, and they help me know what students understand and what they can do. And so I use them every day, and I just, thread them throughout the math hour.
Great, thank you. That's a wonderful reminder of everything we've been saying about how these are so integrated and seamlessly into the teaching process. We have not talked a lot about written formative assessments in terms of, other than talking about exit tickets. And this question came up from a viewer. Should formative assessments be multiple choice, or can they be multiple choice? Is it even possible to design a multiple choice question that reveals misconceptions rather than just seeing how students guessed? And I can imagine how you'll respond to this one. Skip, what do you think about this?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess a quick response is, yeah, you could. But when we talk about the use of the multiple choice item, we usually couch that very particularly in the hinge question. And it's funny, I was laughing when Ruth talked about the hinge question is a deal breaker, because it is. It's a deal breaker for you, your teaching, and gosh, you hope the kids do pretty well with this, because that means you can move forward. And so one of the, Dylan Williams talks about 2 different types of hinge questions. One that would be kind of an open question, and you deal with kid responses, and you kind of summarize those either in your head pretty quickly from a sampling of students, and then decide what you're going to be thinking about as you plan. The other type is the multiple choice hinge, where you actually frame those distractors to sort of get at particular misconceptions. And our work with this is that takes a little bit longer on the front end, because you've got you're working on that question the previous evening or perhaps before the lesson. But on the other side of that is, boy, you know what it means when a kid went for, selection A because they added rather than perhaps they were supposed to subtract, or B, they mixed up the fraction order, whatever it is. I mean, you can and should order those distractors in point so they actually do give you that feedback. So they're quite powerful in that sense. And some people do use them more typically at the intermediate grade levels and on into middle school than they might with primary age children, but certainly there's some potential for that. I think that's how that could be done. Generally, with the kinds of formative assessment techniques we've been talking about. They're pretty informal, kind of connected directly or indirectly to observation, but there is an opportunity to do the multiple choice format in a way that I just noted.
Great. Thank you so much, Skip. A lot of people had questions about how to document and track all this information as they're observing, as they're noticing. John, what are some of the best tools or technologies that you have discovered to kind of make use of that helps you manage the data? Are you on mute, John?
Sorry about that. I apologize. So to answer your question, I think a nice, simple observation tool, the old clipboard with that records with all the students' names and having a nice general rubric that looks at whether or not students get it, which tells me if I need to enrich or extend. And students who might not get it, and that tells me that I need to reteach or revisit. Technology obviously can be a great tool as well. So I might use my phone or my tablet to snap a picture of what students are doing as an artifact for performance. I might use Google Forms or Google Docs to take notes or to quickly gather some data about students. I think that tools like Padlet or Plickers or today's Meet, those are also nice Web 2.0 tools that allow us to collect formative assessment data in real time. So to answer the question, I think there's lots of different options, and it really comes down to the user's preference. What's most important is that we are thinking about what students will do, and then connecting that and cataloging that information.
Yeah, and as you know, we've spent some time going through virtually every one of the technological tools that John mentioned, except for maybe QThink. But Go Formative, Explain Everything, Plickers, Google Forms, all of those are probably useful tools that actually gather the information and then provide you with documentation. But by the way, as John led off, there's nothing wrong with monitoring what people are doing with a clipboard and tools that you've created to sort of monitor students yourself.
Right, and I recall you also both saying, taking a picture of student work so that you can catalog that and go back and use that as part of a portfolio later. Great. This is a very controversial question that we get a lot. Should formative assessment be used for grading purposes? Who would like to tackle this one first?
This is Linda. I will. No. I'm done.
Yeah, me too.
No, I'm done.
And this is Bruce. No, absolutely not.
Skip, are you dissenting opinions?
No, I said no. I mean, and actually, you know that. So,
I do.
but I think we should say that here's assessment that's very carefully linked to your planning and your teaching, and every time you use the techniques that we're talking about, you're quote-unquote grading in your head. You have an idea. Pick any student you like in your class tomorrow morning. You have an idea that you've accumulated from the very first day of school till now because of all the things that we've been talking about and other measures you have used. So frankly, if you wanted to, you could pull a grade right now. But we think to use observation to compare, to use a show me to compare, which by the way grades do, is inappropriate relative to the technique. So generally speaking, I think in unison, we would say no. That's not the intent of these tools.
One of the ways that I used formative assessment a lot was I was the clipboard person. It's been a little while since I've been in the classroom, so not all of the technology was available. But and I tried all different kinds of ways of organizing, but just the simple list that John described in a clipboard, and every week I would have a page with the class list on, the topic we were working on, and the date, and I would keep those in a binder so I could really track student growth over time much more so than a test would tell me. And that was really helpful when I was meeting with parents, because I could talk about how, students had progressed, or maybe some things that were still sticky issues for the child, but not in determining a grade or not. More information, more on where is the child. To me, a grade can be somewhat subjective to begin with. And to me, the data that I gathered in doing formative assessment was much more helpful than an A or a B or a C on a report card.
Yeah, and Linda, as you're talking about that, I'm also thinking, as you did that, here's a load of feedback that you could give to a child then, if you felt like it, or at the end of the day, or parent-teacher conference time, and there's discussion about what he or she has done and so forth and so on. So the notion about feedback is really important as we use formative assessment. It doesn't have to be graded feedback.
That's right. The other thing that did was made sure that I checked in with every student several times a week. Nobody fell through the cracks. And if a child did have a misconception, I could make sure that I got back and spent some time with that child, either during class or after class or during extra help time. And again, I have to tell you that I just felt that was so much more helpful as a teacher and in planning instruction than any test, whether a standardized test or a unit test or a high-stakes test, could possibly offer me to helping and supporting a child.
That's great, and that's actually a great segue to the next couple of questions that we will tackle in our remaining 5 or 6 minutes here. I also want to invite people who are listening to enter any questions they still have lingering into the chat, and we'll try to spend a few minutes at the end addressing those. But the next set of questions, it's a big topic, and we're only going to be able to tackle it partially, but it's the idea of differentiation. And when you have learners at all levels in your classroom, how do you differentiate both the assessments, or do you differentiate the assessments, and then also the instruction? So Ruth, we had this from someone. I don't have time to develop 4 different assessments. How do you efficiently use formative assessment with a wide range of needs in the classroom, including when you have English language learners or ESL students in your classroom? What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, I say I would never develop 4 different assessments. I use the same show me or the convince me prompt for all students, and I just have to say that I'm always surprised with the different ways students think about a problem and explain it, and I'm always amazed how students share their ideas and how much they learn from listening to each other and how much students will actually help each other. I use the same hinge question for all students, and I use the same exit task with all students. But when I collect the information, and usually on my feet, I then develop the strategies that I need to work with the students that are struggling with the concept, and then, or the students who have totally misunderstood or have a misconception. So what I do is I usually have a little bit of group work. I might call 3 or 4 students that have similar misconceptions and work with them as I find time with the math period. I'm not really worried about giving the assessments and the time it takes. I'm just really thinking about what it is. What is it that I'm going to do to help the ELL students or the SPED students? And
So
usually I...
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, Linda.
Ruth, you finished?
Well, I was just going to say that I like to, again, call them to the math table and literally listen to their thinking, what they do understand, and talk it through with them.
So one of the things that I like to do is use that formative assessment to then differentiate the tasks, whether it's for the next, usually it's the next day. And I can get a sense of where are the students, who needs a little extra help, which I might use a similar task, but make the context a little easier, or as Ruth mentioned, call them to the table. But I see so many classrooms where differentiation means I have to have 5 different things going on in the classroom, and I don't think that's the case. I think through, let's just take practicing basic facts, that I have some kids that are still working on some strategies. I just did this with a group of teachers, and we talked about a silly game of Top It, or what we used to call War, and my variations on that. But I can take that same game and I can identify who still needs to work on doubles, who still needs to work on doubles plus one, who's ready to work on groups of 10. And I can have the kids in 3 or 4 different groups, and they're all playing the same activity, but they have a different goal in mind as they're doing it. I don't have to have 5 different things going on in the classroom. Or I can have a task where for the kids that are still struggling that I want to spend a little bit more time with, I might make the numbers in that task simpler. And I might make the kids who are kind of on grade level still doing the task, but practicing it with one of my favorite tasks is finding the dimensions of a rectangle. I call it the patio problem. If you have 12 tiles or 36 tiles, or for the kids who get it, what if you're going to make a patio with 72 tiles, which is really extending the concept for those kids. But everybody's working on a similar task. They're just doing it at the level that they're ready to do it. And I think that that makes differentiation so much more manageable than trying to have 5 different things going on in your classroom. So that's one way that I use formative assessment in my instruction.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice example, Linda, and it gets back to I think the theme of this webinar, and that is, you know, what you plan and how you think about that planning and the assessment linked to it will guide your instruction. I don't know that anybody can survive having 5 math groups in a classroom. And I don't know that it makes a whole lot of great sense of taking a reading model and saying, you know, you ought to be doing that in mathematics, because frankly, this subject is different. And the kind of differentiation that Linda talked about in just taking a really good test and exploding it out. First of all, it allows all children to be engaged in important mathematics. And you're not discriminating, you're differentiating, and that's a significant difference.
And I think so many teachers, Skip, make that so difficult because they're told just differentiate. And I think giving teachers some very practical ways to differentiate and meet the individual needs in their classroom without having to think about, oh my goodness, so many of these elementary teachers already have to plan 3 or 4 subjects a day, and now we're going to make them plan 4 or 5 math groups? That's not going to happen.
And you all must have intuited what the next question is, which is because, as we've discussed, these things go hand in hand, the formative assessment and the instruction. And you both spoke to this. I think we have time for a comment from one more of you if you have anything further to say, and then we've had one question come in from the audience. Or maybe we've said all we want to say. Skip, a question came in from Alicia, who is viewing today. She said that you mentioned the formative 5. What would those formative 5 be? Would you like to clarify that?
I should have you respond to that, Erin. The formative 5 happens to be a title of a book that's coming out from Corwin in a few months. And what my colleagues, John Ray and Beth Cobett and I have done is spend, you know, parts of the last 3 years working with math specialists and then their teachers on the topic of formative assessment, and very particularly classroom-based formative assessment and techniques that work. And we distilled it down to 5 things that teachers can do every day in their classroom to really guide their instruction, their planning, and kind of link that to assessment. And we've talked about them sort of indirectly, and that's observation, the use of the interview, what we refer to as the show me technique, hinge questions, and exit tasks. And the manuscript we're referring to addresses all those with very you know, comments from classroom teachers who have been using them and ways to sort of create tools, not unlike some of the tools that Linda talked about, the kind of tool that you can actually put on the clipboard, as well as technological tools to help monitor the use of these techniques. So that's what the formative 5 is.
Great, thank you. If anyone would like to just offer a closing thought to close us out.
Well, I mean, I think the thread of this conversation has been that for far too long, educators have thought about, have actually put stuck assessment on a corner and largely talked about assessment as summative assessments that you do when somebody tells you to do them. And what we're saying is that there's value, significant value in formative assessment, and it needs to be connected to a teacher's planning and then their teaching every day of the instructional year, and the elements of that.
Thank you. John, you said you mentioned offline that you wanted to add a note to that as well. You might still be on mute.
Well, what I think he wanted to say is that, you know, as you plan, you anticipate the use of these particular assessment techniques, whether it's observation or what have you, and then it's tightly connected to the planning process.
Indeed, and I've heard you all say that again and again. Well, thank you. I really want to thank all of the panelists for their time today, their preparation for this. Thank you to the viewers who were able to attend. As I mentioned, we will be recording this, and we will share the recording. So if you have colleagues that you would like to forward the link to, you may do that. Shameless plug, because I'm the Corwin Math editor, I have to put the books up on the final slide here. So if you visit corwin.com/math, you'll see what is the latest and greatest, including the books from all of these authors, which are either new or coming out very soon. So thank you all for your time today. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye now.